I'm Sarah Einstein, I'm chaplain here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you today, and particularly to welcome Professor June Boyce-Tillman, who, as you all know, is an expert on Hildegard of Bingen, the 10th century mystic and one of the newest saints. She's very recently been made a saint, and so in honour of the occasion, obviously, we've got all this bunting up.
Quite a lot of colour.
Professor June Boyce-Tillman is also a distinguished composer and teacher of music, professor of music at Winchester University, and has a particular interest in music, spirituality and theology, and including music in education. Today she's going to introduce Hildegard for us, and in particular her visions of the Holy Trinity. She'll speak for about 30-40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. We've also got copies of her book, The Creative Spirit, that I understand came about through miraculous intervention at the last minute. So these will be available for sale at the end of the hour that we've got together. So if I could now hand over to Professor June Boyce-Tillman.
I'm going to do the presentation in two parts. The first, I'm going to tell her story so that you have some idea of where she was and who she was. And I shall tell that by becoming Hildegard for a while, only temporarily, so don't worry. And then I will talk about the visions of the Trinity, contextualize them in the Middle Ages, and then sing their applications for today. And as part of the story of Hildegard, I will sing a hymn to the Virgin in Latin, which was the language that she used, and you have the translation of that hymn on the sheet labelled Singing the Mystery. Thank you very much. I am Hildegard. I know the cost of keeping silent, and I know the cost of speaking out. Hear my story. Perhaps you know me as Hildegard of Bingen, but it was several miles from Bingen where I was born, in the Nahe Valley in Germany, in the year of our Lord 1098. Do you know the Rhineland? Do any of you know it? Yes? It is the most beautiful place, is it not? Rich and green, moist and fruitful. The rolling hills stretch as far as the eye can see, crowned here and there with tall crags and watchtowers that seem to reach to the sky. And on the southern slopes, the carefully tended vineyards ripple like waves on the skirts of the hills. And in the valleys, the neat fields and tidy villages offer ample sustenance for humankind and their beasts. And through it all flows the mighty river Rhine, bringing growth and fruitfulness to the earth and a means of movement and transport to all who live there. They call it now, I believe, the fatherland. To me, it will always be mother. For the earth is our mother. She is the mother of all, for she contains within herself all the seeds of all. The earth produces all verdancy, all fruitfulness. All creation comes from it. And it contains not only the seeds of humankind, but the substance of the incarnation of God's own Son. Being the 10th child, I was tithed to God and sent at the age of 8 to live at the Abbey of St. Disibode, where I lived with an anchoress called Jutta. From Jutta I learned so much, of everyday things, of spinning and of weaving, and of the ever-present, all-encircling love of God and of the Holy Spirit, which flows like sap through our lives and our bones. From my earliest childhood, God revealed himself to me in many ways. Sometimes in words, sometimes in images, sometimes in music, sometimes in all three. But always he shows himself in the splendor of the natural world. But I learned also to see the corruption of the world, the violation of the natural world, the injustice in church and state, and I knew anger as well as joy. I looked and I listened. I saw and I heard, but I kept silent. Yet ever within me grew the pressure to speak out. But how could I, a woman, make my voice heard? Who would listen to me? Who would believe my words, not learned by rote from any human tutor? How could my words be in any way useful? For it was not out of humility, but it was not out of stubbornness that I refused. It was out of a supposed humility that I refused to speak. How could I then have recognized the burning torment spoken of by the prophets of the Old Testament when the word of God burns in the heart and aches in the bones? I consulted my spiritual directors, people I was accustomed to respect and indeed to obey. They told me it was not my place to speak out. My role was to tend the needs of my community and pray ever faithfully, but silently. But lo, in the 41st year of my life's course, I was taken up in a vision, and in it I beheld a great radiance, and in the radiance was formed a voice, and the voice spoke to me and said, "Dust of dust, ashes of ashes, corruption of corruption, tell and write what you see and what you hear." And behold, I stood up, and I set my hand to writing. The words poured out of me in a torrent, a great outpouring of God's word, his spirit, his debar, and I no longer felt beaten down. I started to write my first book. I called it Scivias, Knowing the Ways. It was to take me 10 years to complete. And contrary to my previous fears and timidity, I was heard. People came to me from far and near, and I received and sent many letters, some to the leaders of the day, Bernard of Clairvaux and the Emperor Barbarossa. The Holy Father heard of me, and he sent a commission to investigate me. They found me competent and authentic, and he wrote, commending and encouraging my writing. By this time, Jutta had died, and I had been elected leader, or abbess, you might say, of our small community of women. We were still crammed together in Jutta's tiny house. The monks of St. Disibode had expanded too, and taking up all the available land for their buildings and their farms. Abbot Cuno was implacable. And can you imagine the endless meetings, the arguments and the counter-arguments, and the endless frustration of not being heard? In the end, we just packed up our things and left, taking our dowries with us and not waiting for the men's permission. We started to build on the side of the Rhine, on a hill that I dedicated to my dear St. Rupert. I myself supervised the building, making sure that all was spacious and comfortable. We even had piped water. And perhaps I remembered all those journeys to the washing trough and the breaking of the ice on it. But more I think our Creator God does not delight in our bodily discomfort, especially when it is self-inflicted. I have heard it said that the body is at war with the soul. But how can this be? He made us as whole beings, and our souls can only find expression through the actions of our bodies. Indeed, I am persuaded that when body and soul act together in mutual agreement, they receive the highest reward of mutual joy. On the Rupertsberg, I and my sisters explored new ways to worship God, sometimes wearing colourful robes and golden crowns as befits the brides of Christ. Not always, I may say, with ecclesiastical approval. My vast correspondence continued, and I wrote many books on the lives of the saints, on medicine and healing, theology. And I, a woman in her 60s, preached from the pulpits of the great cathedrals and abbeys. And ever I spoke of God's justice, and I exhorted the leaders of church and state to excise corruption and to work for the peace and harmony of all creation. And in it, and through it, and round it, is always the music. For music expresses most clearly the soul's longing for God and the peace and harmony of all creation as God first made it. But in the last year of my life, the music was silenced. It was a time of great grief and heavy sadness. You see, we had buried in the grounds of our convent a young man who had been excommunicated as a revolutionary, and we would not yield up his body. But he'd confessed before he died, and his body was entitled to rest in hallowed ground. I, though I was old and ill, went out and removed all traces of the grave so that it could not be violated. For I fear the justice of God more than the justice of men. The bishop did not agree with me. He placed us under the interdict, so we could no longer sing the office or receive communion. After 8 months, I wrote him a letter about the theology of music, and reminding him that those who silence the music of God on earth will have no part of the song of the angels in heaven. The interdict was lifted, and the music goes on. O viridissima Virga, ave quae inventosa flebros giscitationis sanctorum prodisti, cum venit tempus, quod tu floruisti in ramis tuis. Ave, ave sit tibi, quia calo solis in te sudavit, sicut odo balsami. Nam in te floruit pulcher flos, qui odorem dedit omnibus aromatibus, quae arida erant, et illa paruerunt omnia in viriditate plena, unde celi dederunt rorum supergramen, et omnis terra leta facta est, coniam viscera ipsius frumentum protularunt, et quoniam volucres celi nidos in ipsa habuerunt. Deinde facta est escaminibus, et gaudium manium epulantium, unde, o suavis Virgo, in te te non deficit ulum gaudium, ec omniae contempsit, nunc autem lausit altissimo. But the words and the songs that I uttered came not from any human source. God moves where he wills, and not at the will of any earthly creature. And I am ever in fear and trembling, and I ever doubt my own capacities. But I lift my hands to God, that I may be carried as a feather is carried, without power or strength of its own, on the breath of the wind. I died in the year 1179, but I do not think that death has silenced me. Some of you today may hear my voice. I was 81 years old when I had died. So I had kept silent for half my life, and I had spoken out for half my life. Perhaps that is the right balance. Taking in, receiving, and giving out. In and out. Like breathing. Like the breath of God. Well, there she is. So what is she to say to us about the Trinity? Just a little bit about her. Where are we? There, let's have a look. There she is. That's how she signs herself. You see herself with the visionary experience coming down in the fire from heaven, and her faithful priest Volmar, whose task was simply to take down what she said, make it into decent Latin, and got told off if he put anything else in. She wouldn't have had the formal education that the men would have had in Latin. She would have simply learnt it by being immersed in the life of the monastery. She is often portrayed in this particular one with Volmar, but also possibly Richardus of Stade there, where you see her in the context of the convent. And so unlike some of the mystics where they're portrayed on their own, she's always portrayed in a community, and you'll see how that fits her thinking. She's not on her own, she contextualizes it in that community. That's perhaps the most famous vision, often used as a mandala by people. That's the vision of the angels, the 9 orders of the angels, very carefully drawn with the mystery of God in the middle. I suggest that that's an incredibly powerful image for this Trinity Sunday, really. So, where does she sit today? This is a Korean theologian talking about Western theology, that its emphasis on individual salvation and morality was often disruptive of non-Western cultures, focusing on individual with no recognition of community or social context. So she sits in the context of Western culture in the loss of that communal aspect, which would have been second nature for her in the Middle Ages in Europe. But somehow or other, once we got past the so-called Enlightenment, it got lost along the way. The models of the Trinity that we have around us now, this is perhaps the most famous, the Rublev icon of the Trinity, 3 people with the 4th side open for us, 3 people in neutral relationship, the unity and the diversity well expressed, and us being called into that particular feast there. The Eastern model, there we have it at the top there. Very grateful to 2 of my colleagues for helping me draw those models. So that's the Eastern model. The Western model, again, the distance is in many ways emphasized there. We have the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Spirit, but somehow a bit separate from us, and operating on the world from a distance. And sometimes when I sing the great Trinitarian hymns, I think it sometimes emphasizes the distance, although the sermon this morning told us much more about the presence and the distance in a way that sometimes is not preached on Trinity Sunday. And here we have a Western image from one of the books of Hours of God. You can see looking down. The Spirit is all those wings around there upon the dead sun there. But the problem with that particular model, it expresses a hierarchical God, which in some ways infantilizes human beings, requiring people to remain in positions of children forever, rather than relationships of mutuality. So the notion of mutuality is something, again, which Hildegard speaks to, as we shall see. But interestingly, people often say, well, she was ahead of her time. Actually, she wasn't. She was part of her time. The prevailing doctrine, the prevailing system of medicine that we have, which you see set out there, is the Doctrine of Humours. And the Doctrine of Humours, which originated in Galen's rediscovery of Hippocrates, saw the whole of the natural world and us in relationship. So it saw, and this left-hand side, the black bile, phlegm, blood, and yellow, has been one of the reasons it's been discredited. But because we can't we can't find what the substance called what they meant by black bile. But the notion that there are temperaments, that each of us are either hot, cold, wet, and dry. So there you see nature is a balance of cold, dry, cold, wet, and warm, dry. And they're associated with the elements along the side there. And all of us are somehow or other, we have one of those elements dominant. So if we're cold, dry, we're melancholics, and so on, the phlegmatic, and so on and so forth. But the way the system worked was, if you're going to prescribe something for somebody, let's take me, probably quite fiery, and it's raining outside, so I'm not in my chosen element. You have to put all that in the equation before you start deciding whether you're going to give me fennel or spelt. Because, in a sense, we're not independent of that. We're in relationship with the natural world, and so on. So that was the system that was prevailing, the medical system. And in some ways, it's a much more subtle system than we have at the moment, with, again, that excessive individuality, and that if you prescribe this is what will happen, whether the person is old, young, well, ill, short, fat, tall, thin. That notion of very simple, primitive cause and effect is much more primitive than the more subtle relationships with Doctrine of Humours, which we find, of course, in Ayurvedic systems and also to a certain extent in the Chinese systems. There's another drawing of it. We can see hot, dry, wet, and cold in relationship to the seasons as well. So we have a sort of chosen season as well in some. And then we get people today like Eysenck, and his theories of intelligence, taking it up and developing the notion of personality typology based on that particular. But you see, he hasn't linked it with the natural world. We've got sort of colours which might, but it's now much more linked with the theory of personality. But what it shows us is that people are, again, picking that up as part of the system. And here we have a diagram from that period. We see the human being and so on connected, and that makes sense of some of the Hildegard drawings. So in the ecological model, we have the world in the middle, rather than, we have the Trinity, the world in the middle of the Trinity, rather than the Trinity separated, and we'll see that. This is one of the main drawings of the Trinity, the so-called person in sapphire blue. And the person in the middle, we can see that it could be a picture of the Christ or Jesus. And there's a description. The bright light designates the Father. That's the outer circle. The figure in sapphire blue without flaw of obstinacy, envy, or iniquity. It's her writing in Scivias designates the Son, and the glowing fire is the Holy Spirit. So again, that's quite often an image that people use, but putting themselves in as the person in the middle. And you'll notice that if we go back one slide, you'll see that the figure in the middle has the top of the head open, And that notion of opening the top of the head and so on links with Paul, in a sense, and channels of the Spirit and all of that. We go further in that image of the Trinity and we get to this one, and that's the image that I want to concentrate on, really. This one, we see now the head of God at the top, a little head of God the Father. And then we see the figure of the Son encapsulating the whole of the world, with the human being in the middle of it and the Spirit flowing around the outside. So in this particular model, the second person of the Trinity, rather than just being Jesus or the Christ, or Jesus Christ, the world becomes the second figure of the Trinity. So the world is God's body, and that all inside. And it's interesting that when we look at science and we think of the debates about science we're having today, of course the original origin of science was in order to understand God, because you were investigating the very nature of God. God created the world, and therefore investigating the world. And in a sense, this predates some of those scientific thinking, but it's in that frame of medieval Europe. So God the Father appears, bears the great wheel of creation in his breast. It is supported, embraced by the figure of flaming love, the Spirit. And in the middle of the universal wheel stands a human being, projecting beyond the tiny earth into the realms of universal forces with their various elements and rays. The human figure seems to hold the universal network or system in its hands, thus accepting humanity's task of creative commitment to the world. And so we're getting a model of ourselves within the context of a wider world and within the context of God. And here's another version. Now the head of God is gone, but we still see that notion of the encompassing of the Spirit, and there we have the seasons within that. So the changingness of the seasons is within that context of creation, the cosmos. So, if the second person of the Trinity is the entire world, we're asked to view the world as God's body, and Sally McFaig takes this up there, includes more than just Christians and more than just human beings. And we have people like Anne Primavesi talking about, let's not call ourselves human beings, and we have to talk about the human and the other than human world. And she's invented the descriptor Gaian beings. So we're Gaian beings. And we contain, of course, all the elements of the world within us. And we are inextricably bound up. In fact, the myth of space travel is an interesting one. As we realised that we were destroying the planet, of course, the idea of taking off in a spaceship and going somewhere else seemed very attractive, so we could wreck this place and then disappear off quite happily somewhere else and start again. But of course, the truth of space travel is that we have to take air with us, because we can't exist without oxygen. We're mostly made up of water, so we've got to have a plentiful water supply. We've got to be able to keep warm, so we need some fire in space. And we've got to have food, which comes from the earth. So the notion that we can take off from the world completely denies the fact that in human beings we're inextricably bound up with the elements. We can't actually exist without them. So that notion of the world as God's body. And here, this is Hildegard writing, it's my translation, just as the creator loves the creation, so also does the creation love the creator. Creation was designed to be beautifully enriched, to be lavish, to be richly endowed with the love of the creator. The whole world has been hugged by this kiss. So the notion of God hugging the world and hugging the world into being. Mechtild of Magdeburg, to take it up another 100 years later, God said to the soul, I desired you before the world began. I desire you now as you desire me. And where the two desires of two come together, their love is perfected. So that notion of that joining together. This is Rowan Williams in his book on Christianity. Sees the Trinity as the way in which God is known, but he defines this as God encountered as sheer creativity, the generative power in things, but this perception must be tested and in a sense denied by the awareness of waste, cruelty and disorder. But you heard in the story of Hildegard how Hildegard was constantly seeing life as the restoration of what she calls justice, which is right relationship, which is what Rowan Williams is picking up here. So this vision of God, often called sapiential, which means a wisdom vision, God is continually bodying forth creation. So there's a continual process of incarnation going on, the cosmic body of Christ, where the further we enter into that synergy, which the sapiential cosmology depicts, the more we know ourselves as encountering the yearning of God, the divine eros, experiencing the power of greening being, transfigured by the Spirit into shining whiteness. So that notion of not a once-for-all creation, but a continually embodying of creation. If we embody the praxis which this implies, we cannot separate the well-being and wholeness of the least sentient thing from the spiritual, salvific becomings of the human person and the integrity of the whole of public life. So, it's interesting really, here we are with flags and celebrating, in a sense, monarchy. In Western modernity and in Greco-Roman antiquity, Kyriarchy had been in tension with the democratic ethos and system of equality and freedom. In a radical democratic system, power is not exercised through power over or through violence and subordination, which some versions of the Trinity seem to imply, but through the human capacity for respect, responsibility, self-determination and self-esteem. This radical democratic ethos has again and again engendered emancipatory movements that insist on the equal freedom, dignity, and equal rights of all. And it's interesting to be under the flags, because in a sense, we have in our current monarch an example of interdependence and of a monarchy which has kept some sort of relationship. And in that sense, she has tried to merge the notion of the monarchy with a notion of democracy, and of course has maintained so beautifully her own humility within that interdependence. But in that model of the universe as God's body, then there is a much greater sense of interdependence within it. I'll flick over that. And so sin, in Hildegard's thinking, becomes broken relation. It's everywhere there is a broken relationship. Sinners are out of touchness with the fact that we are in relation, that our lives are connected at the root, and that this is the sacred basis of creatureliness, our humanity, our lives together on planet Earth, weakened immeasurably by sin, generation upon generation. We do evil, and this I think is interesting, without having a clue that it is evil that we are doing. And all the thinking of the ecological people about our footprint, you know, in a sense, when we buy one of the T-shirts with that, the motif for I mean, do we really seriously think about the sweatshops in which it may have been made? And when we argue about whether it's worth £10 or £20, are we not arguing about some of the other bits of creation which are in fact paying for that for us? So it's evil. So we haven't got that sense that we're in interrelationship. And here we have this Carter Heyward talking about those examples and examples of what we need: courage, compassion, interestingly anger. And you heard in the story of Hildegard, she was very angry about where relationships are broken, and that's a righteous anger about injustice, and forgiveness touching healing and faith. And of course, anger and forgiveness are uneasy bedfellows. At what point do you forgive? At what point is justice achieved? And of course, in our world, there's an uneasy relationship between peace and justice, because peace often means injustice, and justice often means warfare and anger around. And we see that being played out, of course, in Syria and the Middle East in many countries, but even in our own country in various areas at the moment. So there we have a sin, not as my sin against somebody else, although that's part of it, but socio-historical sins, cultural and ideological sins as well, makes that notion not just me, but the cosmos as a whole. So we have the notion that the creation is a process in which we're engaging. We are co-creators with God in this process. There's a mutuality about it, which will make new relationships. We'll see where they're broken and renew them all the time, and this is an ongoing process. And so, just to finish with, to give time for the questions. This was a hymn I was asked to write for Ascensiontide, because Ascension becomes different if we look at the world as God's body. Because if we're in God's body, at Ascension we all enter into heaven, and the great gates swing right for all of us, and we all tumble into heaven. So it isn't Jesus going away, as I heard several times over this Ascensiontide. It's not. We are in Jesus, and we tumble in together into the center of the Trinity. So this is one of the hymn there. Angels sing Christ procession. All creation enters into the middle. All our hopes and all our fears, all our joys and all our tears, all our visions and despair nestle in God's sheltering care. Heaven and earth are interlaced. God has shown that interface. How our true integrity glows within the deity. Isn't it exciting? Wonderful, isn't it? So we don't just watch it, we're in it. Isn't that great? And let the feasting now begin. Clowns and creatures tumble in. In God's living we are free. Let us claim our liberty. Okay, and another one, this was redeeming a hymn that I guess is sung here many times. Within the encircling planets, God's spirit gently flows, restoring right connection through which creation grows. With subtle understanding, God takes each tiny part and makes them fit together within a wounded heart. Come on. We pray you, vibrant spirit, infuse our hearts today, that we may act within you and understand your way. The joy of relationship the cosmos can breathe, as you encircle all things and lovingly reweave the strands of human living. The joy, disputes and pain are taken and rewoven to make life flow again. And we are called to do your work and make the weaving fair. Reflect your deep transforming love, infusing all our care. Our human institutions, our politics, our wealth bear fruit in justice making to serve a nation's health. The difficult decisions to nurture and control, the maintenance of order and all that is involved. We take place within your wisdom, still making all things new. We ask that your amazing grace will fill all we pursue. That was my attempt to set out that theology of the world as God's body. I think it's exciting. I think it calls us to realize our role in that bringing together of all the parts of creation in right relationship. The play of the Godhead, the play of the Godhead, the Trinity's dance, embraces the earth in a sacred romance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's the highest level of participation that we've had in one of these forum sessions. So I imagine there was a lot in there. Do people have questions that they'd like to put to June? Well, I think the Trinity is a very interesting concept. I think it's brilliant.
I mean, we can't understand, and I'm talking for myself now, rather than particularly rooting in that, although that's coloured my thinking. At the end of the day, religion is about God being not knowable. That is the fundamental basis of religion. That's, in a sense, its purpose, because it guards against human arrogance at its best, religion. So it has to keep the knowability in some contrast with the unknowability. So whatever model we have of God is the attempt to know the unknowable. So why is the Trinity a good one? And I think it is a good one, because it contains diversity and unity within that. And quite often Christianity has gone towards the unity and lost the diversity of the Trinity. And that's where it fits with a diverse number of systems, that there isn't a one system fits all, a notion, that diversity is there at the very heart of God. And that notion that I think, again, it was the sermon this morning, which was, we so often turn diversity into division. And I think that's a huge problem for us. Diversity needs to be celebrated, not turned into reasons for opposition. So I think if we keep, and it's a paradox. It's a wonderful paradox, 3 and 1 and 1 and 3. I mean, in a sense, what could be a better meditation than 3 and 1 and 1 and 3, 3 and 1? If we could only hold that together, we would know about systems which are both united and diverse. But over and over again, we go one way or the other. In fact, mostly in Christianity, we want to emphasize our sort of monotheism, so we lose the diversity. But as a model, it says that diversity can be held together in some sort of relationship, which is not uniformity. So we both confuse diversity with division, and we confuse unity with uniformity. And that's the dilemma. Over and over again, those are, and that's what I've dealt with in Unconventional Wisdom. If we don't keep diversity and unity in relationship, then both of them become twisted versions of what they should be. So diversity becomes division, and unity becomes uniformity. And Hildegard, in her middle book, and I'm using her middle book, talks about a vice being a twisted form of a virtue. So if you see a vice, you don't ban it. You say, how do I untwist it into its right form? And I think the notion of the Trinity and how we handle diversity and unity is a very good example. If we don't keep diversity and unity in some sort of flow with one another, then diversity becomes division and unity becomes uniformity. And that happens over and over again. Now, I know that the examples I gave here were of democratic type systems. And so on, in your reflection on the UN. I think we haven't. I think there's a big question about, exporting Western systems into other cultures, and I don't think we've done it well, and in many places it's been an excuse for great corruption. I was in Brunei relatively recently. Nothing democratic about Brunei. Got a very rich man in charge of it, and the people think it's wonderful. And the level of gratitude, I was reading the Brunei Times and I was there, we're so grateful to the Sultan because he's got this wonderful house and, we've given, it was incredible. I mean, why aren't people in this society grateful for when they buy a house and they've got enough money to do it, or they're given a lovely flat to live in? There's more gratitude to be found there than where it's our right, So, and I think, we have a lot to learn from those societies as much as... So I think that's where diversity, there's a richness in that diversity as well. But I think the model of it, I think it's a brilliant model. It's complex, but it contains the very heart of God, which is very difficult for the West, and that's paradox. When the West have a problem, they want to solve it. When the East have a problem, they want to live with it. So, and the Trinity is a paradox. It's like the sound of one hand clapping. How can there be one God with three persons? It's wonderful. It's a lifetime's meditation. I hope that answers what you said. Well, I don't think that those are models. I think the Western model of the Trinity is post-Hildegard. I think, it's a model that's developed, I think, beyond that. I think one has to think about Hildegard in the context of the Doctrine of Humours, in the context of of a society where God is a given. I mean, the Western model feeds Richard Dawkins, of course, because if what you've got is God up here and the world down here and some strings, all you have to do is to cut the strings and you're okay. I mean, it feeds in, doesn't it? You know, okay, it's straightforward. But if you have got the world as the body, it's got much more difficult to break that division so neatly. So I think that one, of course, it was the illustration was from the Book of Hours, which is post Hildegard. I'm not sure of the date of the Rublev, but icon, but that's probably earlier. But we don't know how much, you know, Eastern material was available in Western Europe at the time, so we don't know how that split between orthodoxy and how much went, you know, was travelling around. Probably some of it was, but we don't know, in a sense, what were those communications between the Eastern Orthodox traditions and the Western traditions. So I wouldn't... what I would say is, because over and over again people say she was ahead of her time, actually she was very much part of her time. You know, that was her time. And when you look at that image of the you know, the veins and the human being, you can see that her visions are drawing on the stuff which is around at the time, which isn't surprising. But in a sense, that's a 21st century revisiting of or looking back, rather than one that originated there. Well, the figure of wisdom is there. Wisdom is a figure with three wings. One wing reaches heaven, one wing reaches earth, and interestingly, because we always get heaven and earth in all our images, but the third flies everywhere. Marvellous image of wisdom, and that's her. And she is a wisdom theologian. You know, she has this notion, and we saw in that quotation from Mary Gray, in wisdom theology, God is intimately bound up with creation, and the much more dominant model. So we have, in a sense, two strands of theology. One is a much more separate model, and we have a very linear model of God stretching across. So God creates the world, it goes all wrong, the Son comes, redeems the world, and at the end of time we'll all be judged. So nice linear model stretched out. In the wisdom models, the whole thing is much more circular. It's going on all the time. So redemption is always happening, and so on. It's not a once-for-all event. The once-for-all event is revealing something which is a truth at the very heart of it all, and so on. So and God is intimately bound up with humanity. And if we take the wisdom scriptures from the Old Testament, they're marvellously practical documents. You know, if you throw a stone into your neighbour's garden, they may throw a stone back. I mean, you know, you know, that's the way relationship works. I mean, it's a piece of practical advice. And the essence of wisdom theology is that the central point is incarnation. What the world as the body of God says is the central doctrine of Christianity is incarnation. That's, you know, okay, we need redeeming, but the central doctrine, and we often forget it, is that God is intimately bound up with the world. So that notion but wisdom theology, you see, if we look at it, it comes through history, it goes along sort of here, it pops its head up. Then, of course, the authorities get terribly worried by it, because in general it's put by mystics who say, actually, I don't need you, Pope, Bishop, Archbishop, I don't need you lot, because I've got a direct line to the Spirit. So, of course, the authorities never like it. So it gets dobbed on the head, and back it goes again. Then it sweeps up again in various figures. Starts with Dionysius, the Areopagite, pops up through Hildegard, Theodore de Chardin. Now, you know, we've got little pops of it all the way along the history. But it doesn't sort of continue like the dominant streams of theology do. And it says, really, and Mary Magdalene's the one, if you look at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the kingdom of heaven is within. So that notion, and the mystic and the prophet are often the same person. Because, in a sense, they won't kowtow. If the Spirit tells them to act in this way, like the bishop, she undergoes what was probably worse than excommunication, actually, which was to have to whisper the office and not be able to sing for 8 months. But she'll risk that because she fears the justice of God more than the justice of men. Now, that sort of person's a threat. That's what Jesus was. Jesus was a wisdom theologian. I mean, lots of the things we associate with Jesus are simply straight quotations from the Hebrew wisdom scriptures. You know, And he was crucified because he was a threat. He's told people to, the kingdom of heaven was within. That was the fundamental problem there, in a sense. So I think the notion of the mystic, the prophet, the notion of where wisdom theology sits, but in wisdom theology, God is constantly interacting. When you throw a stone into your neighbour's garden, that's part of God. You've messed up a bit. It's not something separate. God isn't standing there and judging. God's saying, your neighbour, you're in relationship with them. Why don't you do that? Go and sort it out. So it's that wonderful, intimate relationship of God. Does that answer the question? Absolutely. Whatever images we create of God, like the Trinity, they are an attempt to make some sense of the unknowable. In that sense, they're always flawed, but in that sense, they always teach us something if they're good models. And I think a good model always acknowledges that. It always acknowledges. One of my colleagues at university who teaches theology, she writes on the top of the board, "I may be wrong, but," and then gives a lecture. So all knowledge is provisional. And that is our humility. It doesn't mean we don't know anything, but it means we know enough to take the next step with integrity. And that's all we're asked to do. If we claim more than that, then actually what we do is fuel religious wars. And they are the most dangerous, because they're based on absolute certainty. And they're the most dangerous wars of all. Yes. No. It's the Pope sends a commission to investigate her, and once that's happened, she can do that.
What's the reaction to her sermon?
We don't know. As with all of these things, we have her autobiography, but we can't put the visions in and things, so we haven't got a coherent picture of her, or we haven't got any of that. I'm not sure that we've got many of the texts, much really, of the sermons and so on. So I think we know that she did. And we know that that was quite remarkable, but we also know that the abbesses had the power of bishops, really, because, of course, they were all interfacing with the aristocracy, of course. The bishops and the abbesses were all, also holding power in the world, and there was that network and so on operating. So they were people of influence. And so on, Richardis of Stade, you see her close friend in there. She was a daughter of one of the nobles, and she's given a convent, you see, and that's why she has to leave Rufsburg. So I think but I think you're absolutely right. There was infinitely more power for women, religious women in positions of authority in the church in the Middle Ages than we have got anywhere in the church today. And that is the truth of it. Now, we can be very depressed about that, and some people are, particularly about what's happening around women bishops at the moment. But if you regard, and I go back to these linear views of history and more circular views of history, where all of us have to rework the same issues, but usually with just different technology. So the internet gives us a different technology to work out the same things that Hildegard was working out. They're not, in a sense. That circular view of history. And so rather than being depressed, what we say is the notion of gender and authority, which is what's being played out, and I was played out, of course, by Mary Magdalene and St. Peter at the beginning, we've got to keep all of those balls in place. So we don't just opt out and say, oh, give up, they are better off then, we've lost the struggle. It's where a Darwinian view of evolution in cultural terms is not very helpful. It works very well in the sense the natural world, but I'm not sure that cultures evolve in that way. They don't progress. And I think we can't call some cultures primitive. I think there's a complete misreading of evolution. If it's circular, then we will have the same debates. In a sense, she got excommunicated. I'm working towards excommunication at 80. It seems much better than being at the back of an old people's home. At least you're doing something that people notice, and you're fighting for justice, You're out there doing it. So I think rather than being discouraged, one thinks of ways and strategies in which, I suppose, more the Buddhist wheels and things like this, but that's the wisdom theology, that we're all keep having to work these things out. So we must be, she was skillful. She was very skillful to get affirmed by the Pope. Indeed, Bernard of Clairvaux, she wrote to first, more or less dismissed her as she wrote saying, please, you look at my visions, and he wrote back and said, that's very nice. And that was the end of it. It was only when the Pope affirmed her that Bernard of Clairvaux started to take some notice. So she was skillful. I'm a Foucauldian in many ways culturally, and I think, you know, if you are at the bottom of the pile, then you must be skillful in the way that you try and do it. So you don't opt out. It's not a cause for despair or depression. It's a cause for being skillful in trying to restore right relationship, which it seems that's about. So I think you're right, but I think it's a cause for being skillful, not for despairing.
The bell has just toiled, or is toiling now, which means that we have to bring this to a close. I personally, and I'm sure many others, found that both fascinating and very inspiring as well. So I'd like to thank you today.